Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the astute amongst you might have noticed that I'm wearing my mourning clothes. That is, mourning, not mourning. This is a trick that Cato used to do. I haven't had a bereavement, don't worry, everything's fine. It's something Cato used to do back in ancient Rome. Cato the Younger, I mean, although I'm sure Cato the Elder would have approved of, if not done it himself, is he would wear mourning clothes to sort of protest against the withering of the Roman state and constitution. And that is essentially what I'm doing in today because of the rather sad news, I thought. I'll pop it up here, BBC, that hereditary peers are going to be abolished in this country and that effectively there is no more resistance to this. What happened essentially is this process started in 1999, if I'm correct. And this was one of Tony Blair's lunatic reforms to destroy the English constitution, essentially. And essentially that started the process whereby hereditary peers would be removed. And it was, to be fair, this isn't a new innovation. It is Tony Blair's fault, so I'm not going to specifically blame the current government of the day, although, you know, they are doing something bad, I would argue. But no, this is Tony Blair's fault, inherently, because it was the bill that was passed in 1999 that said that we will no longer have hereditary seats in our parliament in any guise, and therefore that the hereditary peerages in the Lords have to be removed. However, there was a compromise measure struck up because, of course, the Tory and crossbench hereditaries were not going to go down without a fight, and there was over 600 hereditaries at the time. So there was a compromise struck up, and there were 92 hereditaries of all parties that were allowed to remain in 1999, and that is the system we've had up until today, when we've heard about the rather sad passing of the bill that's going to finally cave that in. Now, the Baroness Smith, I believe, who is a leading Labour peer, I believe, has essentially said that this is just continuing the principle that was arranged in 1999, which is essentially that people should not be sitting in any part of our parliament because of a hereditary principle. However, not only am I going to query the ethics of that, or not the ethics necessarily, but of the goodness of that judgment, because I believe that hereditaries have got a good place in our constitution, but also I'm going to query that explanation as a whole, because I think that that's portraying it as much more high-minded than it actually is. I think there's something much more sinister going on here. So let's take those two parts. Now, YouTube's a very, very good thing. It democratizes information, as I've said previously, but also it brings up a lot of older stuff that was never intended for YouTube can now be accessed by the general public, even though the places where it would have been broadcast previously are no longer available to us, and the technologies that it was recorded on also. So that's a rather long-winded way of me introducing The Lord's Tale, which is a documentary that was made in about the turn of this millennium, to portray the side of the hereditaries when it was originally decided that hereditaries had to go by Tony Blair. Now, the Labour hereditaries didn't want to take part in this documentary, so they're not featured. However, all the Tory and crossbench ones were perfectly happy to be involved. I don't say that all of them were involved, because I dare say there was a lot of them. But they speak to a good deal, and what I can honestly say is, having watched that, I don't expect you to watch it, of course. Having watched that, I can honestly say that there was not a single hereditary peer that I saw who didn't deserve that peerage. Whether or not hereditary is a good way to decide, besides the point, all those hereditaries absolutely deserved their place in the House of Lords, and I'm happy that they were part of the governing apparatus of this country. Now, there is the point that was raised, I think it might have been Baroness Smith again, saying that this is not about individuals, this is about the principle. So there is that to consider, which is essentially negates the point that I just made, that hereditaries are good people and they're hardworking. Well, the hereditary principle, let's talk about the hereditary principle, because we had a monarchy debate in the York College Debating Society the other day, and we absolutely trounced the opposition. I was, of course, a monarchist. And monarchy, of course, runs on the hereditary principle. Now, even Republicans, I'm going to argue, couldn't support the hereditary principle because, well, the point about the monarchy is essentially that why should one branch of our constitutional apparatus operate on hereditarily if another shouldn't? Surely, if it's unacceptable, it should be unacceptable in all cases, and we should go back to, if not having a republic and removing the king, then a kind of Witanagamot system whereby a council of elders elects the king. So I await that bill coming through the Labour Treasury bench, but I suspect it won't be happening because this isn't really about the principle. But even if we don't talk about the monarchy, even if we just talk about life, how many businesses do you go past on a daily basis that will say, you know, I don't know, Wilkin and Son or something, family butchers? Do you not think, oh, a family butchers, isn't that lovely? And farms passed down through generations. There's so many instances that we see of being passed down the generations, being a good and effective thing. Let's even talk about sports, for example. There's the, you're much more likely to be good at football if your father is a famous professional footballer. So I would say that the hereditary principle, while not always perfect, no principle is always perfect, and I think that it gets glossed over a lot more than it should do because, especially in the case of a hereditary peerage, for example. So it's, you know, my father sells cars and takes pictures. I'm not going to be very good at selling cars and taking pictures, and I don't intend to do that as a career. So I don't, you know, it doesn't work in all cases, but I do think it works more often than people give it credit for. You know, my politics teacher takes the mickey out of the hereditary principle a lot of the time. He essentially says, well, if you go to the dentist and the dentist goes up and says, well, don't worry, my father was a dentist, so I know exactly what I'm doing. You would be quite reasonably worried about that. And while there is a point in there, you do get dentists whose fathers were dentists. And that's not to say that just because of their birth they are entitled to do a thing, to hold a position, to have a career and so forth. But what that does mean is that they are predisposed to have learned about that career from their parents. Think about how much we pick up from our parents just in general life, how many mannerisms, figures of speech, dress sense, anything like that, you know, diet even, how much of that we pick up from our parents, how much we absorb from our socialization. Surely it would be ridiculous to argue that there's none of that process goes into what job or what role you fulfill. A further point is, this works very well with the monarchy example actually, is say the king, Prince Charles as he was, you know, he was born, he was the... Well, of course he was born. He's the Queen's son, and therefore we all know that provided no horrible accidents happen, he's going to become the king. And he knows that. He knows that provided there's no horrible accidents, he is going to become king. Now, say you're in that position. I think I'd like to, you know, try and learn how to be a good king. And I think that's the same with hereditaries, is you get put into a position where you know there is something you are going to have to do in later life. And I think that compels you to try and be good at it. And I think the evidence for that is in how well educated, how well rounded individuals, how useful for their country a lot of these hereditary peers were. I use the documentary as an example yet again. Not a single one of them, I think, didn't deserve his seat in his and her or her seat in the Lords. So there's a point in favour of the hereditary principle, which Labour has been rubbishing. But now let's talk about whether that is really what they're on about. Because regardless of whether the hereditary principle is defensible or not, I think it absolutely is. Let's talk about, are they doing it because they believe in the hereditary principle? I don't think they are. And I think that they are absolutely doing this for their own interests and their own benefits. Tony Blair, when he was campaigning for this House of Lords reform, used to say that, oh, well, people say there's no Tory opposition anymore, that we won this general election with such a landslide, there's no opposition. But there is an opposition, and it's unelected, and it's up in the House of Lords. And that's, that got rounds of applause and things, but surely that's just him absolutely admitting that going after the House of Lords is a party political manoeuvre and is about control. Because the House of Lords... it's not got so much power as it used to before the 1911 Parliament Act, which I will talk about a bit later on. But the House of Lords still has immense delaying power. They can delay a bill for up to, I think, a year. It could actually be longer, I'm not sure. But yes, up to a year, and then they can send it back to the Commons 3 times with amendments made. And this is happening right now with the assisted dying bill. The assisted dying bill, private members bill by Kim Leadbeater, has been delayed and amended several, I forget what the figure was in the newspaper the other day, but it's, something ridiculous amount of amendments that have been tacked on. In fact, the lady who opened York College, Dame Tanny Gray-Thompson, she has tacked on an amendment asking that the drugs that they would use to euthanize these people be clinically tested, which the Daily Express had a field day with, saying that you can't clinically test suicide drugs because that'll just kill the people who you're testing on. That's besides the point. So, but this shows that the Lords is still an effective governing, revising chamber to check the power of the Commons, because one thing I have talked about is the disadvantage of complete, utter democracy, because democracy, while it is of course a good thing, it's an admirable thing, and I've staunchly stood up for democracy. I would always say democracy is a good thing. However, like all things, it must be moderated, because democracy creates politicians, it creates demagogues, it creates populism, and these things are bad, and they have to be tempered. So that is why you need an unelected house. My video on the House of Lords reform that happened in 1911, I go into greater depth about why you need to temper democracy with a level of expertise. But that is essentially the point, is the idea that democracy has faults, aristocracy has faults, mix the two together, and you get a very nice constitutional blend. You have a revising chamber and a legislative chamber, and they work together to create sensible, well thought through legislation. Because, of course, democracy works in election cycles. An election cycle is about 5 years maximum, and legislation takes a lot of time to think through properly, because bear in mind, there are people whose lives are going to be affected by a lot of legislation. Anyway, that's besides the point. Where the devil was I? Sorry, forgive me. That's I went off on a hell of a tangent there. So you need an unelected chamber, I would say. Yes, so the Lords is still an effective check on the Commons, and I think it absolutely should be an effective check on the Commons, and I think that that's a symbol of a healthy parliamentary democracy. And this is what Tony Blair was trying to do. He was trying to get more power. He was trying to turn the House of Lords into essentially what is the word? An extension of the Commons, essentially, just another replica of the Commons. And this is proved by the figures of life peerage. So if you're not aware, in the House of Lords, there are several ways you can be appointed to it. You can either be hereditary peer, which is what's being abolished. You can be a Lords spiritual, which is all the bishops and several different representatives of faith. I would actually like there to be more representatives of different faith in the House of Lords. I think that would be a good thing. But all the Church of England bishops are in there. There's some Catholics, Methodists, 2 rabbis, I think. I'd like to see, maybe some Muslims in there. I think that would be a jolly good thing. Why not have a Buddhist, I think that would be a good thing. But yes, and then there's life peerages. Now, life peerages are equally undemocratic because you are not elected by anybody, but you don't pass the title down to your next of kin. So it dies with you. It's for your life, hence life peerage. Now, life peerages are more often than not appointed at the discretion of the Prime Minister when he or she resigns, and these are called the resignation honours. Now, I have some statistics here, high estimate figures for how many peerages, how many life peerages each Prime Minister created. Keir Starmer, currently on 96 as we're going. Boris Johnson, 132. I'm working up, by the way. This isn't all the Prime Ministers, but we're working up. Harold Wilson, 202. John Major, 160. Thatcher, 201. Cameron, 243. And way ahead of everybody else, guess who? Tony Blair at about 374 life peerages created. So this is cronyism, I would argue. This is absolutely cronyism, and this is an attempt to just make the House of Lords a yes chamber for the democratic elected Commons, is the idea that you just want to have the House of Lords offer as little effective scrutiny of legislation as possible, to just let bills through, go straight to royal assent, have as little delaying as possible, so governments in their 5-year election cycles could just get on, bang, 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 get through all their manifesto legislation. And this is bad. This is really bad because the Commons is so terrible at legislation. It's so bad because they think in election cycles, because they think in popularity, because they think in polling. They're only thinking about what's going to be popular, not what's right. And what is popular and right are two very, very different things. The death penalty would be brought back pretty much instantaneously if it was open to a referendum, I would say. And I would argue the death penalty is a really very bad thing. I've written about why it's a bad thing. So there you have as good an example as any of why what is popular is not always what is right. And this is why they want to abolish the hereditaries, because they're not in the pocket of the party political system, because they can't be controlled by patronage. You see, because there is no patronage involved with hereditary peers. Hereditary peers owe their position to their genealogy, to their lineage, not to any party. Trying to whip hereditary peer is absolutely useless, because what can you whip them with? They haven't got a constituency, they haven't got an electorate. You know, they live in a house in the country, and they're not always massive houses in the country either. You can't whip a hereditary peer. Life peers, however, a lot of the time it is literally just cronyism, appointing your office secretaries, your clerks, your brother even. Boris Johnson appointed Joe Johnson to the peerage. You do just get cronyism. You just get filling the house with people who you know are going to be loyal to you. And this is so bad. This is so bad for the British Constitution, because it completely negates the point of having an upper chamber at all. Why not just abolish all lords? And I'll tell you why they're not just going to abolish all lords, because this was never about democracy. It's never about principles. This is about having control. It is about populism and demagogues controlling the political system. And that is bad, I would say. And that is why I've got my mourning clothes on today, because terrible things are happening. And what is worse is it's not likely to get any better, because, one, a campaign to reinstate hereditary peers is going to fall on deaf ears. Nobody is seriously wanting hereditary peers in the political system today except myself, I believe, anyway. It's a very unpopular opinion. And two, the Tories, who are perhaps the only political party who would realistically stand against this, have caved in, because they've been offered a compromise measure saying they can keep 15 hereditary peers on as life peers, not as hereditaries. So once they die, they're done. But they can keep 15 hereditaries on as life peers. So they've been offered a compromise, and the Lord True, who's a top Tory lord, has essentially said, "Okay, that's fine. We'll go with that." And that is because of the impotence of the Lords, essentially. The Lords has been so watered down, defanged, that essentially any opposition to this could only look worse in the long run. It's like what happened with the People's Budget in 1908, is the idea that any opposition they give to this is just going to reaffirm public perceptions of Lords as being fuddy-duddies who don't like change and don't like to give away their own power, which they don't deserve. That's the public perception, and if they stood up to this, it would just fuel that. So that's why that's not going to happen. The Tories have caved in. Labour are obviously not going to defend the hereditary peers. They're the ones getting rid of it. Reform, absolutely not, because there's no reform peers at the minute. They need to control that house as much as anything if they want to get on. Greens, ditto, same problem. SDP are actually, they want to get rid of the bishops as well, so they're even more radical on the matter. There is no serious, I mean, Lib Dems, God knows Lib Dems have just abolished the House of Lords altogether. So there is not a single political party who is seriously thinking about retaining the Lords or beefing them up in any way. And I just think that's such a shame, because they have such a good influence on British politics. Apologies, the iPhone storage ran out, and it's been keeping on doing it for every take I've been trying to do to finish this off, so I'll try and get done quickly. But I did just want to mention a little factoid I have about Lord Curzon, who was around at the time when this conflict was sort of hatching, as it were. It was in its infancy, and he was there, and he saw the problems. As with most things, Curzon saw the problems and tried to come up with a solution. He wrote 2 articles in the National Review in which he talked about how he would reform the upper house. He proposed that it should have 4 elements: hereditary peers qualified by some form of public service, life peers nominated by the government of the day, another non-hereditary category of peer elected by the House of Commons for a stated number of years, and spiritual peers, but representing only the established church. Now, I've mentioned that I don't agree with the only representing the established church. I think there should be, more religious officials in the Lords. But I do think that this system, if implemented, there was no serious way it would have been implemented, of course, because who's going to listen to Curzon? He was young at the time in the 1880s. This was when he was a fresh-faced, backbencher. But that system it demonstrates an incredible amount of wisdom, because what that would have done is it would have prevented the Commons from saying that the Lords was just a bulwark of aristocratic privilege in a time when it might have been a bit closer to that than it is now. And it would have given the peers a genuine claim to be representative, because you would have government-elected peers, you would have the life peers, hereditaries will be qualified by national service. And I don't think it was mentioned there, but he did also think that there should be ambassadors, colonial officials, retired army generals and things who should all go into the life peerages. So I do just think it's worth saying that there were attempts to try and get around this problem right the way back to the Victorian period. Don't forget the Victorians were always boasting about how modern and forward-thinking they were. But yes, anyway, so that is essentially my State of the Constitution address. I just thought I'd mention this because it really irritated me, and I just think it's such a shame. But if you can't change things, don't worry about them, and if you can change them, change them. That is the motto, and that is where we're going to end today, because I don't want to run out of storage again. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and God bless.